Alright, Clam Blitz. The most complicated game out of the four. Clever hook here, let's jump into how it works. This will be a lot, so if you think you already know everything, feel free to skip ahead. Clams spawn in groups of 3 around the map. If you have paint where the clams are, you'll be able to see them through walls and on the map. Swim into a clam to pick it up. You can check the HUD to see how many clams each team has in total, as well as how many each individual has. If you pick up 8 clams, they turn into a power clam, which is revealed on the map. If you die while holding clams, you'll drop an amount of them. And if you die with a power clam, it just drops normally. Using certain specials, like Kraken or Splashdown, will drop all of the clams you're carrying. These clams that have dropped, either from somebody dying using a special or from being thrown with the A or L buttons, will break after a little bit. Each team has a basket, which has this barrier around it. Throwing a normal clam at the barrier will do nothing to it, but throwing a power clam will break it. While the barrier is down, the opposite team's clam basket will raise, becoming impervious to enemy power clams, and a little jingle will play. Additionally, a 10-second timer will begin. Throwing a normal clam into the basket while the barrier is down will score 3 points, and add 3 seconds to that timer, although it can't push it above that initial 10 seconds. Throwing in a power clam, including the initial clam that broke the barrier, will score you 20 points and reset the timer to 10 seconds. When the timer ends, the scoring team will gain penalty points equal to half of the points they scored. If the score at the end of the push is a tie, they'll have 1 point added to their total to prevent ties. Once the timer ends, the basket scoring team's basket lowers instantly, whereas the team that was getting scored on's basket raises, lowering after the 10 seconds it takes to regenerate its barrier. As it raises, it'll drop a free power clam, which most of the community calls the pity clam. This pity clam won't spawn if there already is a pity clam, and it won't despawn until it's been picked up and subsequently dropped. Okay, I think that's everything. Oh wait, no. If one team is holding any number of power clams, and the other team is not holding any power clams, the team with the balls get passive special charge. If both teams are holding power clams, no matter how many, the losing team gets passive special charge. Oh, also, fun fact, you see these humps near the basket? That's approximately the distance from which you can throw a power clam. And on that topic, power clams don't throw as far as normal clams. Okay, I think that's everything I want to talk about. I could probably get into some niche clam spawn mechanics, but I don't understand that stuff, and neither do any comp players I know, so I'm just going to ignore it. Alright, where to even begin talking about Clam Blitz strategy? I think let's start with what the ideal push looks like. You need 3 things to score in clams. First, you need clams to score, obviously. Second, you need their barrier to be down, also obvious. But third, and this is where new players tend to struggle, you need space to safely score. Throwing clams into the basket can be a very vulnerable position to be in. Often, enemies will have high ground positions over where you want to be scoring, and standing out in the open, looking up, is just really unsafe. It's the same idea as how painting the zone can open you up to getting shot at, but 10 times more, because you aren't using your main weapon and your vision is mitigated. So, if we want to get really meaningful pushes, we want to maintain control of the area around the basket. I'll just be calling this basket control. I'll talk a little bit about making sure you have enough clams when the push starts later, but for now let's just assume you have a bunch of clams and you've just gotten basket control. What you see a lot of low-level players do is throw in all of their clams as fast as they can, and then their push ends because the basket closes. We don't want that. Because penalty points are applied when the basket closes, we want to be scoring as many points in as few pushes as possible. So what you should be doing is waiting a little bit for the timer to tick down, and then throwing in a clam to refresh the timer. Wait a little, throw in a clam, wait a little, throw in a clam. And usually what you're doing while waiting is fighting for basket control, maintaining paint, throwing bombs, zoning out enemies, etc. Quick side note, but throwing in a power clam is time efficient, but not resource efficient. Time is a resource, but you know what I mean. Throwing in the 8 normal clams it would take to make a power clam will give you 24 points, and if you're staggering those clams, can keep the basket open for 24 additional seconds. Power clam, on the other hand, scores 20 points and will only extend the duration by at most 10 seconds. So, if you have plenty of time to score them, try and throw clams in individually. If you have a lot of clams, but not very much time to score them, however, just making a power clam and dunking it could be your best bet. Not very much time to score them could mean you're actively losing basket control, so you literally won't be able to score soon. And often in those situations, people will just throw in all of their clams as quickly as possible before, they can't anymore. But it could also just mean you have other things you really need to be doing. Maybe you're about to use Crab Tank, which doesn't drop your clams, but does leave you unable to score. So instead of locking down 7 clams and potentially losing the push because of it, or instead of throwing in all 7 of your clams and using the Crab Tank way too late, you just pick up a clam, score the power clam, and then use your special. At some point during a push, if you're doing a good enough job maintaining basket control and keeping the basket open, you're going to run out of clams. This is really where soloq pushes fall apart. What you want to do is have somebody back up to get clams. Ideally, it's whoever doesn't have clams and contributes to basket control the least. Let's say you're the one backing up. Ideally, your teammates have a firm enough grip on basket control that they're able to hold on while you're gone. The closer you are to losing basket control, the less time you want to spend away. Like, let's say it's a 4v4, but we have a crab tank or whatever. I'll back up to get clams, making it a 3v4, then we use crab, and the crab holds the enemies back. If I'm gone for too long, though, the enemies will eventually leverage their numbers advantage and get basket back. So I want to get back quickly in order to help hold basket advantage with however many clams I've gotten. On the other hand, let's say we've gotten some good kills and it's a 4v2, I can just back up and get tons of clams. In this hypothetical, the enemies will have to wait for respawns, and then once they respawn and finally have the numbers advantage, my teammate then stalls them out with crab, so I just have tons of time. Same thing applies to the other thing you need, which is having the basket open. The more clams your teammates have, the longer they can keep the basket open, as long as they're throwing them in delayed. So the more clams your teammates have, the longer you can afford to spend backing up looking for clams. That's all the basic stuff on backing up for clams. I'm going to go over a couple of niche optimizations, but they're nothing more than niche optimizations. When you're backing up to get clams, usually you don't want to have more than one person go, since, maybe you can hold out in a 3v4, but not a 2v4. But if you really don't think you're going to lose basket control anytime soon, it can be good to have multiple people back up, just so you aren't wasting time having 3 people hold space that only 2 people need to hold. Sometimes if my teammates are super winning their fights while I'm backing up for clams, and I know they won't need me for a while, I'll just throw my clams to my teammates instead of scoring them myself. And that way I don't have to spend as much time swimming back and forth, and I can get even more clams. Sometimes, if your teammates are going to have basket control for a while, it can be good to swim back in from spawn instead of jumping in. That way you can be collecting clams that are the furthest away from the push, and thus the hardest for your teammates to get. At a certain point, if the push has gone on for long enough, it can get difficult to find clams on the map close enough for you to get them and score. So I'll have to super jump to my teammates in order to be fast enough, and just having people grab the faraway clams as they come in from spawn helps with that. Also, having lots of paint control behind you makes it a lot easier to find and collect clams. Clean segue. With those 3 things you need, getting clams, keeping the basket open, and having basket control, the act of doing one weakens the others. If you're backing up to get clams, you aren't in position to keep the basket open or fight for space. If you're scoring clams, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position where you can't fight for space, and you're literally getting rid of clams. And if you're fighting for space, you aren't getting clams or scoring. If you lose too much of any of those 3 things, the push ends. So for effective pushes, it's all about maintaining the right balance. Next, I want to talk about 2 things that come up the most often by far when I'm coaching. We've kind of talked about them with the other game modes, but these mistakes are much more pronounced and distinct in clams. The first one is making sure you're getting basket control before you score. And I could generalize this further to say don't die for points. It's basically the same as don't push before you're ready. If you don't have the space to safely score, but you really want to get that power clam in, you're unlikely to get a very good push. And remember, the opponents get a power clam when your push ends. Obviously, they won't always be able to get it in, but let's assume that most of the time they will, which I'll talk about later. If all you're scoring in your push is a single power clam, you're giving the opponents just as many points as you're scoring, and you're going 1 down to do so. So please don't just run at the basket trying to get a power clam in. Good pushes come from space. The second mistake I see a ton of teams making is that their pushes are ending because they all die, rather than ending because they just accept that they can't keep pushing it back up to hold space. We talked about this a bit in the zones video too. Let's say it's a 4v4, we're scoring and then the enemies get a pick. We know we're going to lose basket control, so we throw in as many clams as we can before it's not safe anymore, and then we just back up. We play around strong positions to stall the enemies as much as possible, and then by the time our teammate has respawned, we still have mid control. Now let's say instead we just kept throwing in as many clams as we possibly could. We scored an extra 9 points, but we got wiped and the opponents gained a lot of space. Were those points really worth all that space? Against coordinated teams, often the answer is no. I've won games off of counter pushes because the enemies overstepped and got wiped. Conventional wisdom is that it's worth dying to get a power clam in, but otherwise try and preserve your life. One way to think about it is number of fights needed to get a push, and this is part of why a lot of bot players don't like clams. In zones, you just need to get to the zone. In Rainmaker and Tower, you score by moving forward, but in Clam Blitz, you have to move all the way forward before you can even start scoring. And then you have to hold space for long enough to get your clams in. And that just means you need to win a lot more fights. Okay, so for example, let's say we're pushing, the enemies are zoned back past here, and then they get a pick. Okay, we're 1 down, they have won that fight, and we kind of back up to hold this area, and then, I don't know, maybe let's say they force us all the way out here before their teammates respawn. And Now, we still have mid control. And then, like, I don't know. This isn't quite how I chunk the map, but whatever. We still have control over these areas, so, like, now the enemies need to win a fight in order to get back into mid. And then they need to take some time to collect clams, so they aren't, like, super fast to push up, and we're able to hold on to control of our plat. So then, like, they need to win another fight to kind of get up onto here. And then they need to win maybe that fight gives them basket control. Maybe they need to win one more fight, depending on how things have gone. So it's like 3 to 4 fights to get basket control. And then if they don't have enough clams to get lead, which they won't always, sometimes they will, but often they won't. Like, in order to get a really meaningful push, it'll take a bit of time. People will have to go back and forth to get clams. So they'll need to keep winning fights around basket. Which is all just to say, it can take a long time for counter pushes to happen. But if we go like 2 or 3 down on, like, when we're scoring, the enemies might just have the numbers advantage to get mid back. And then, like, they get a pick and they take here, and then now it's only like 2 to 3 pushes before they start scoring. Or like if we go 2 down, they get full mid control, and then like 2 of us die in mid. And now they just like have full basket control. It's like 2 fights, and they're able to like move into these strong positions or whatever, and it just gets really bad. So like on clams, especially when you're scoring, it can take a lot of fights for the opponents will need to win a lot of fights in order to start scoring, and you don't want to win those fights for the opponents, if that makes any sense. Like, you don't want to go too many down and let them skip some of those fights. Okay, that's the bulk of everything I wanted to talk about, but let's go over a few more concepts. If you learned the game from Squid School, like I did, you were taught that you want to avoid making a power clam in neutral. Because it marks your position, in a perfect world, everybody has 7 clams as you roll up to the basket, and then you quickly make a power clam and score. This is not true. I mean, that's a perfectly fine way to do it, but usually you do want to make a power clam. Typically, you're playing with a backline. Typically, opponents are going to know where your backline is at all times, regardless of whether or not they're marked on the map. So it's not a meaningful disadvantage to make a power clam early and have your backline hold it. There are several upsides to doing this. The most obvious one, now you have a power clam. So instead of needing to throw some amount of clams to whichever teammate has the most, you just need the backline to throw their power clam to whichever teammate is close enough to grab it. Ideally somebody who doesn't have many clams so they don't drop a bunch, but if you already have the power clam formed, you can be pretty flexible about it. Oh, and the reason you have the backline pass the clam to a teammate is just because you don't want them to have to overextend to score. You'd rather them get set up in some strong position. Another advantage to making a power clam early is passive special charge. Like I mentioned earlier, holding a power clam forces the enemy team to also form a power clam, or you get passive special charge. Making a power clam also helps keep your clam economy safe. If you're holding 7 clams and die, you only drop 3. So even if a teammate is there to reclaim them, you've lost 4 clams. And if the opponents pick them up, you are down 7 and the opponents are up 3. Power clam, on the other hand, drops fully, so it's easier to reclaim, and the opponents can't pick it up. If you have a good amount of clams, especially if your teammates don't have many clams, you want to be careful about fighting, because if you die, you just lose all of your team's clams. But if you form a power clam and then just pass it back to your backline, or whatever other teammate is naturally going to be playing safe, now you can push forward with much less risk. It's also a lot easier to just throw a power clam down for a second while you take some aggressive fight than throwing 7 clams, right? It's just faster to move a power clam around. The last thing I want to mention about clam economy is just make sure you're picking up clams if you're near them. I've coached a lot of low-level players that just swim past clams, and getting in the habit of picking them up if they aren't too far out of your way will help your clam econ significantly. I've had a lot of moments where we get a few picks, take a bunch of space, but end up not being able to score because we don't have any clams. You don't want that to happen to you. I think I'm basically done with this video. I just want to cover some pity clam stuff real quick. If the opponents are scoring and you already have pity, try to make sure you pick it up before your basket closes so you get that free power clam. Even if you just pick it up and throw it on the floor, which is often what I end up doing, and it despawns, that's the same end result as doing nothing, so you might as well. Lastly, don't just pick up the pity clam for no reason. It's a really strong resource because you always have access to it. You don't need to be carrying it around, revealing yourself on the map and risking losing it. If your team fully gets wiped, but you have the pity, you still have 8 clams. If you can leave pity where it is and form a power clam normally, that's usually going to be much better. Typically, the way you see pity used is if you're actively scoring, somebody respawning will pick it up and super jump it in for the guaranteed score. If it's an overtime situation and you know your next push either succeeds or you lose the game, it can be worth grabbing early. But typically it's best to just save it for moments where you can super jump it in. Splatoon is complicated, but Clam Blitz especially. I can't cover every little thing, etc., etc. But I think especially with this video, I've given you everything you need to know to play this game mode properly. That's all for me for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.